So I'm in charge of this panel. I'm your moderator for this very interesting panel that we've put together with some notable names from the Python and open source community, as well as some folks from Microsoft. The topic of our panel is...
You're notable, too.
So our topic for this panel is how to integrate open source into a large corporate environment. I'd like to start by having all of the panelists introduce themselves. So we'll start with Steve.
My name's Steve Dower. I work at Microsoft. I've been here for about 3 years now. I also contribute to CPython and have been working on a project at Microsoft that's been open source the entire time I've been here, which is the Python tools for Visual Studio.
I'm Brian Granger, and I'm a professor at Cal Poly, one of the lead developers and leaders of Jupyter and IPython, and also a NumFocus board member.
My name is Mark Wiebe. I'm with ThinkBox Software. We create visual effects software primarily. I've contributed to NumPy and started the Dyn project.
My name is Brett Cannon. I've been a core contributor to Python for about 12 years now. I have been working at Microsoft for 2 weeks. Less than 2 months ago, I left Google after having been there for about 4 years.
So this panel is somewhat open-ended in format, but I'd like to start with some personal questions for Steve and Brett, both of who are Microsoft employees and both of who are open source contributors. Brett, as many of you know, is a longtime contributor to CPython, and I believe you were brought into this role with full knowledge that you're a contributor, with full knowledge that part of your role here at Microsoft would be contributing to CPython.
Yes, to the best of my knowledge.
Did you find in that situation that you still had to negotiate certain things internally in order to work as freely with the open source community as you were previously?
No, but honestly, that's because in my job hunt, I made that a requirement. I personally chose to only speak to companies where I knew open source was being done. For instance, I knew Steve was already here and it was being allowed to, on company time, to contribute to Python, CPython specifically. So the only reason I made sure as a prerequisite to speak to any potential employer that they had to have that culture now in place of allowing people on paid time to work on open source if that was going to be part of their job.
So Steve, your contribution at Microsoft has been going on for a couple of years now. When you started working at open source in Microsoft, was this a role that you had to create or a role that was created for you?
So the role was somewhat created for me. I was actually hired by Microsoft on the basis of my contributions to a project that was already open source, which was the Visual Studio tooling, was open source from really early on through the strong wishes of the program manager on that, who I believe I saw come in somewhere, right up the back. So he's here in the hat, being inconspicuous. Yep, everyone have a look. So the project that I was hired onto was already open source, and I was already making contributions before being hired. And so that was about, that project was kicked off sort of 5-6 years ago, and before that there had been a project, IronPython, that most people are aware of, which Microsoft no longer has. But that project was also open source and was one of the earliest open source projects at Microsoft. So there was some precedent, but it was nothing like it is today. There was a lot of challenges in keeping those projects open and being able to have contributions worked in a way that's less of a problem now. So
contextualized in this fashion, I think the first topic that this panel is here to discuss is how do we contribute to open source at the individual level, at the level of individual developers within a large organization contributing to open source. I think Brian has some experience on the IPython project and the Project Jupyter with contributors inside organizations like Bloomberg and some of the hurdles that they have to overcome in order to make individualized contributions to open source.
Yeah, so IPython and Jupyter have a core team that work heavily on the project. The size of that team is about a dozen people. And in addition to that, we have a halo of contributors in the many hundreds over the history of the project. And a good number of the core contributors work at companies in industry. Some of those companies are sort of directly related to the Python, data science, scientific computing space. Other companies like Bloomberg are less directly related. And I think one of the big things we see is, in many cases, it's a question of the culture in the company. Yes, there are sometimes legal barriers involved in individuals getting permission to contribute to an open source project, but in many cases, it really comes down to company culture. An example of this is a Boston-based startup, Quantopian, that is building on top of Jupyter. And as part of their company culture, it's just a given that they're going to use open source and contribute back to it. And so for us to work with them, the barriers were extremely low. It was more a matter of saying, hey, we should do this. We should work together. Other companies don't have that culture. And so even simple things like the idea that our project is on GitHub and anyone in the world can fork it and submit a pull request is a very novel idea. And it's not necessarily a legal or a license or copyright or patent issue. It's more just a cultural question of, are they familiar with working in this way?
So in order to encourage some participation from the audience, I'd just like a show of hands. How many in the audience have tried to perform some sort of upstream commit or upstream patching from within a corporate environment on work that you were doing related to some corporate initiative? And how many of you have been successful in that effort, and how many of you have been unsuccessful? So how many have actually tried to contribute to open source as part of your job within a corporate environment? How many of you have been successful in that? And how many of you have been unsuccessful in that? So what barriers do we see for the folks up here for the folks who've raised their hands and have been unsuccessful in these contributions, and how can we remove those barriers? How can we encourage better contribution from corporate entities?
So certainly one of the barriers that existed at Microsoft for a long time was sort of a real blockage on, there is a license here that we don't understand. And so as soon as the question sort of gets to the lawyers of what license will this contribution be under, what implications does that have for the rest of our software, if that developer has looked at our code and looked at open source code, how does that interact? And that's something that at Microsoft we've certainly seen change over the years as our legal teams have developed a better understanding of the licenses involved and being able to move through brief periods of flirting with creating our own licenses to looking at the OSI licenses and saying, well, these ones are very safe for us, these ones are less safe, these ones need more investigation, need more work before we can be either using or contributing to them. Basically a whole lot of things get tried there, just as far as isolating developers who are using particular licenses. But we've reached a point now where that list of licenses that are problematic is really, really small, because as we've worked through, our legal teams have worked through analyzing the licenses, most of them have actually turned out to not be an issue, despite the fact that software is our core product. Working with those licenses, using software under those licenses, and contributing to it in a lot of cases looks less and less like a concern.
So for those of you in the audience or on the panel who are package authors or maintainers, who are owners of projects, how do these difficulties in contributions from within corporate entities affect your funding model or your organizational model, since you can't rely on external entities funding development of these projects? By the way, this is a panel that is open to members of the audience to comment as well.
So ThinkBox software is fairly small, and we don't have a lot of resources to throw at open source projects that don't necessarily directly benefit us. So we always have to play that game of trying to figure out, if we contribute to an open source project, are we contributing something that's kind of undercutting our core business, or is it going to benefit both us or benefit us in such a way that it's not something, it's like making our life better, but it would be better to hand that off outside of our our own development resources. An example of something that we introduced to the world was we made a file format for particle files, and we published a spec. And the end result of like having people implement that was we found that we really had to publish our own open source software to implement the spec to make it easy for people to integrate with what we were creating. So that was a way that we saw that like it was an obvious win of interoperability like between us and our customers and other software vendors.
From a project perspective, at least for CPython, one challenge we have is no one on the team is really paid to just do Python as an open source project. There's no one like saying, all right, we're going to hire person X and their job is literally just to do whatever they feel they need to do for Python and keep it healthy and or whatever they want to do. So it tends to cause projects that could potentially be very long-term to take longer and not necessarily be counted as necessarily guaranteed going to happen, because you can't say, all right, if it's going to take a week, they don't necessarily have 5 full days, 8 hours a day to do this. They're just going to have their evenings and their weekends. And so it tends to lead to some questions of potential planning and just availability and just focus and just knowing that this is actually going to happen, and real life's not going to get in the way because someone's kid's sick on the weekend and thus their weekend time for Python's now gone, and now that's blown out a week or a month or whatever, or people go on vacation. And so it really kind of shifts focus and long-term planning in terms of what's possible.
And then the flip side of that is when you do get a company that's willing to pay an employee full-time to work on Python, they, as Mark said, they do have some vested interest. It's like it has to make business sense for the company to do that in most cases, which is why you get someone from Microsoft working on the Windows side of Python, and whereas people from other companies, Rackspace sponsor a lot of Python developers, are not coming in with the same focus and the same, this is supporting a project while also supporting our business, because you have that extra dynamic in there of you are being paid by someone, and that someone then has some entitlement to control what your contributions look like. And I'm sure Brian's seen that as well, as corporations want to contribute towards Jupyter.
Is it worth trying to encourage this at a company with tens of thousands or maybe even hundreds of thousands of employees? Is it worth encouraging those organizations to allocate some small number of employees for the pure purpose of advancing these open source projects, distinct from some business deliverable?
Well, I'm biased. I'm just going to say yes. But, I mean, that's because my position on a big project that's used by who knows how many people driving how many billions of dollars across the world. It's just a tough sell, right? It's one of these, you have to convince people that a project such as Jupyter or Python is such a core piece of your company that you don't need to drive certain feature requests. You need to just make sure the project survives. You need to care about its health and its vibrancy and its community to the extent that we just have to pay someone just to guarantee no matter what happens, the project keeps going. I mean, and you see this happen in certain companies, right? Like companies that produce software just to make sure that if some other company collapses, they're going to be okay and have their rears covered, right? I mean, a famous example is Google Chrome, right? Google created Chrome to be faster, but also made sure that if something happened to Firefox or whatever, they had their browser to make sure that you could still get to their products. And this is true of open source. It's just taking time for certain companies to realize that certain projects at certain levels of the stack have the exact same needs. So, for instance, Linux completely has this covered. Like, people contribute to the Linux Foundation. Linus Torvalds basically has tenure as the Linux kernel manager, and that's all taken care of. It's just other projects at certain variant levels of exposure do or don't get coverage. So, for instance, you guys did great jobs and got your grants for Jupyter, and so there's funding there, and you guys have coverage, and you can make sure that the project keeps going. It's just making sure that certain levels down, such as Python being this thing that's helping push these other projects up, is able to get that kind of coverage. The other problem is, and I had a discussion with Fernando and Brian, is just there's also a difference between the academic world where this is kind of built into the system in terms of encouragement of getting grants and keeping the software and doing this kind of work versus once at enterprise, as you said, where it's hard to convince people that the basic vibrancy and support and health of the project is enough to support, rather than we should do it, but we also want to make sure we have our stuff covered too, and covering that kind of angle as well.
So I think actually that interests of different companies pushing into open source can be really beneficial for those open source projects too. Like in LLVM, you look at the push to make compiler technology more open for IDE type of technology, and GCC was not fulfilling that wish, and that motivated some contributions there. Similarly, adding different backends for different CPU architectures, like those are interests of different corporations that make the project better as a whole.
Oh yeah, I didn't. I'm sorry if anyone took the suggestion that I didn't think those contributions. I mean, what Steve has done for Windows installs has been absolutely fantastic, and it's great, and it's wonderful that Microsoft is paying him basically part of his work time to actually make that happen. It's definitely adds contributions. It gets good coverage. Like we have input for Linux, we have input for Windows. We make sure that everything's going to work cross-platform and no one's going to get screwed and put in a bad position. It does help having different interests and viewpoints in there, definitely.
And a recent one that has come up for CPython recently is Intel's really stepped up to contribute some performance improvements since, like, for their processors, because that is what they know inside out. And I don't know that we know their ulterior motive, if they have one yet. So far, it's
Yeah, we don't know yet.
They want Python to be
have any.
faster on Intel processors, and we're like, okay, we're okay. You came along with a patch and said this makes it faster, and the benchmark's saying yes, it made it faster. I'm like, great. If you want to make Python faster, feel free.
For the sustainability of an open source project, is it a better idea to try to cultivate contributions from within an organization, or to just seek direct funding for an external group?
So I think I think it is a both and I think the context there is that if open source projects want to survive, excuse me, they really have to structure themselves in a very strategic way that in many ways resembles a commercial entity. Let's face it, I mean, open source projects have competition.
Under what business model, if they're structured as a commercial entity?
Well, no, I'm not suggesting that open source projects become commercial entities.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm more proposing that they think of themselves in those same terms, right? Commercial entities and open source projects have competition, right? Our users can go pick different languages, different
Mm-hmm.
libraries. We have to think about funding. I mean, if funding for these projects goes away, and maybe that funding is your own evenings and weekends, but that is I mean, time equals money, and so if you're spending 20 hours a week in the evenings and weekends, well, you have to think about, is that sustainable? A lot of us started to work on open source when we were students or postdocs, and at that point in our lives, that type of time allocation was very sustainable. As you get married and have kids, that's not very popular. I mean, it doesn't work very well to say, you go to the beach today, I'm going to stay home and code all day. And
some of us had kids.
What's that?
Some of us had kids even while we were doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's competition, and there's also customers. And I think the exact business model, if you want to call it a business model, that an individual open source project chooses to use, it really depends on what that landscape looks like. For a project like Jupyter, we're getting a lot of adoption from large companies right now. And so we are, in fact, seeing companies hire full-time developers that work with all of their official company time on our project. We also have users in the academic research space, and so private foundations who are supporting those other projects have a keen interest to make sure that we succeed. And so I think it all depends. I mean, just like any company that starts has to think about, well, who are our customers? What problems are we solving for them? And then framing the business model around that open source projects need to do the same thing, even though they're not selling something. Or I should say the thing they're selling is free, however you want to phrase it.
Yeah, I agree. It is both because they both solve different problems, right? I mean, a company devote time and energy to contribute is great, but then the money can also then go to foundations such as the Python Software Foundation, which then helps foster the community, which helps, or to NumFocus, which allows PyData to happen. And I think they just serve two different purposes because the money is much more fungible in terms of what it can be put towards, while the manpower typically is more focused. I mean, you could potentially have someone who's more like a community volunteer and work on community-specific stuff, but typically business companies, it's much harder to convince them to do that, unless it's as like developer relations and such. But I think both contribute in their own special ways.
So moving on, we have some questions from the audience. Can we get a microphone to them?
Yeah, I guess regarding your earlier point, any suggestion for projects where there are that mode where the original core group developers have gotten older, they're no longer willing to put in tons of hours of personal time. How do you manage that to keep a sustainable project going?
Well, at least for the way it works for core Python is we constantly keep an eye out for people who become active on the issue tracker and people who seem to consistently just be productively contributing. And we just typically reach out to them and say, hey, you're doing some great comments on the issue tracker. Would you like to get developer privileges where you can start editing the metadata on bugs? And then usually they go, yeah, that'd be great. And we give it to them, and they start doing more and more. They start to contribute patches, they make comments and code reviews. And if they keep that up, people tend to notice. And then they go, oh, hey, you know what? You're doing so well. Why don't we just give you the keys and let you just do what you need and just stop having us be a bottleneck? So it's just part of the process for a project is just to keep your eye out for new talent that comes forward because it's just constant. The project's around long enough, as Brian pointed out, you get students, you get people who just do this in their spare time, who just come in at different times in their lives and just come and contribute, and you get them. I mean, for instance, we had Benjamin Peterson become a core developer while he was still in high school. So we snatched him early. But I mean, but that's what happens, right? Now he's getting older, and now he's starting to be able to say, oh, yeah, we should contribute rights for other people. And it just becomes cyclical. And then people just kind of fall off, but then these people who came on earlier are now becoming the people who are now handing out the rights, and it just becomes a virtuous cycle as long as you stay on top of it.
The other thing that we see with CPython, at least, is as contributors get older and sort of get to Brett's age, they get to start negotiating with new companies to get that time allocated to work on things. So some of the longest serving contributors of CPython have negotiated time with their employers and basically said, I am known, like I'm basically famous for working on CPython, and I will come work for you if you let me have 20, 25, 50% time for Python. And there's a number of core developers who have been doing it for a long period of time that are able to make those arrangements with new employers and sometimes with current employers. And so they are able to get that time in a more official capacity rather than doing it on their spare time as they become more senior and more well known for it.
Or they just integrate into the specific jobs they apply for. So for instance, Barry Warsaw is a very good example. He works for Ubuntu and helps maintain Python for Ubuntu and Debian. So he just, as part of his job, just works on Python and that whole ecosystem, and as part of that gets to contribute right back because he finds problems he's having at work, gets to contribute that back as just part of it, and it just becomes, once again, another cycle of just doing his normal job, which then lets him actually contribute directly.
So the project Dyn that I've started, I think, is at a very early stage of that. And what we're working towards is trying to get so it's a fairly ambitious similar to NumPy, trying to define standards and sort of data layouts and a library around that can be used like NumPy, but from C++ and other languages. And that needs to get to a certain level of functionality to be able to like catch. I think it's not quite there yet. And so within ThinkBox, that's not currently a core thing for us, but I'm trying to influence internally some directions of products and things to make it possible that we contribute to the project as well. And so I think it's like after you get past that hobbyist phase, it's like stuff like I'm doing. Erwin, contributor, is getting support from Continuum, contributing to the project. That kind of thing is what I think will work for Dined in the end.
Just one quick comment on this topic for switching questions is that I think our projects, and with Jupyter we're actively trying to do this, is we need to get a little bit more aggressive in seeking to seed and feed that pipeline of people, not just waiting for that pipeline to feed itself by virtue of serendipity. And so seeking to feed it by virtue of training students, by creating the conditions for that to be possible, by engaging, by doing outreach, by lowering the barriers. And those barriers have many, many forms, but just waiting for that for that pipeline to just kind of by happenstance feed itself is I think insufficient if we want an ecosystem of the complexity that we're beginning to reach to really be sustainable and to tackle the kinds of challenges that we're starting to face. Because one or two small projects 10, 15 years ago in isolation was one thing. I think our ecosystem is starting to be something of a scale, of a complexity, of being used in tasks of a level of difficulty that happy random serendipity isn't going to be enough.
So there's a persistent question as to the value of sprints and hackathons. There's a lot of energy around hosting them, but there seem to be the very edge, the widest part of the funnel. What do the narrower parts of the funnel look like?
So we, both Fernando and I have the benefit of being at universities. And so I would say we have a narrow part of the funnel where we actively recruit students at those universities and spend a long time, like literally training one or two students over, a multi-year period, and really bringing them up, teaching them the development process, the software tools, and that is a very deliberate and calculated effort that we put into grant applications and is an official part of our strategy with that.
So this isn't for our open source projects, but ThinkBox has had great success with co-op programs. Like more than half of our developer employees came through a co-op program. And that's a great way to get people interested in your project and teach them kind of the way that you do things if you're a company wanting developers on projects you support.
There's an issue going way back that Brian mentioned about the parallel between what happens in the commercial world and what happens in the open source world. And one of the things that happens in the commercial world is concentration of wealth and resources into a few companies. And that also happens in the open source world, and for a very good reason. On my computer, I can only keep in my head about 5 different packages in my, at one time. And so I have to be very selective about what I choose. But what that creates is a very long tail of projects that only have one contributor and have very little prospect of ever succeeding. And I have a feeling that that tail gets longer and longer and might fall off at some point. How does one prevent all the resources in the open source world from coalescing around a few projects and having all the others die on the vine?
I think just almost by definition, the way open source starts will prevent that from happening. For instance, so I personally, for instance, have multiple projects that I'm like one of the only core contributors, or I start off and just happen to organically get a couple contributors, and I still contribute to them. So that long tail, I don't think is really going to drop off and disappear, because I don't think commercial pushes towards coalescing towards a single thing is going to lead to people to stop wanting to do hobby projects on the weekend. So that's what I mean by open source is by definition just something people typically do for love, not for money. And it just happens that we've now ended up in this space in this industry where open source actually does generate revenue for people, and thus they decide to spend money on it to help keep it going. I mean, it's a very unique position we've developed over, I don't know, what do you guys say, 10 years? Since this is all kind of started money being funneled into open source like it has. So it's still kind of new, really, compared to the length of time that software has really existed. But I personally feel people will always want to spend time on the weekends. Kids in university and high school will constantly still want to just make their programs and toss them up there, and I don't think that's going to disappear. Now, in terms of the actual money specifically getting focused towards individual projects, it's going to happen potentially, and it's going to honestly come down to whether or not someone comes along and does a good job, and then suddenly the focus shifts. I mean, you could have said the exact same thing about Perl, like back in the beginning of the 2000s. Like, that was the language, and that's where all the money should have been going. And now Perl isn't quite as big of a thing, and Python picked up that slack. It could happen to Python if we're not careful. It's just things shift, just like in the commercial market, and things move around, and nothing's set in stone. And this is why Brian says we have to kind of keep an eye on things and realize there's competition and keep moving forward, making sure we foster our community and realize we can't neglect anything, or else people will just walk away. So I think it's basically the long tail will always be there because people will just want to do software and just want to put it up for fun. And in terms of the correlation of the money, it's possible, but it can also shift around very fluidly because it is just software in the end.
And another aspect of this, so if there was a project in this community that was that had the most resources, it's Jupyter for sure. And exactly what Brett said is happening in that we have full-time staff working on Jupyter, but every single one of those full-time staff has numerous other open source projects that are much smaller, that have maybe 1 or 2 developers, and they spend significant amount of time on that, and we encourage it. We really want people to be doing that because we recognize that without this long tail, Jupyter is really pretty useless, right? If there was no libraries for people to use when they opened up their notebooks, well, who cares? And I don't think we're the only project that does this. There's this sort of halo of activity that happens around these big projects that in some ways is responsible for that long tail's health. And so I think that definitely is a dynamic that happens in this community.
Well, I think it's a mistake to treat it, though, as a static dynamic over time, which both of your comments do. It's more like, I think, the recording industry. In the diffusion of music over the internet, it's meant that a few artists make it extremely big, and most artists make it not at all. So they can only function as hobbyist musicians, which means they can't support themselves doing their music, which means that their music can only be partially done, which means it never is able to break out of the shell. And I think we're being complacent if we think that that same dynamic won't happen in the open source world.
There is certainly an aspect of popular projects at various points, and projects sort of like the popularity lifting, and so a lot of people jump on board, and over time that may decline, and so it's less interesting for people. Certainly that's how projects in the open source world break out. They do tend to come from one person putting something up, and someone else gets excited about it, and suddenly you have 2 people working on it, because that motivates the first person to keep working on it, and you do get that cycle. And something like Python, like CPython, will suddenly blow up and has lots of contributors, and then it's about maintaining that momentum. Exactly as you say, like for a recording artist, if an artist puts out a massive hit album and then doesn't follow it up, they're going to fall out of the public view. And so it is about keeping that excitement going somehow, and we're back sort of at the competition side of things. You have to keep the freshness coming, you have to keep the excitement about the project coming, and if you get complacent, then yeah, you'll look less interesting to the population, so less people are interested in contributing. And balancing that with corporate contributions, a lot of people get into open source because they don't want to contribute they aren't satisfied with doing the job that they're just paid to do, to write the code they're just paid to do. They want to do something outside of that, more exciting than that. And when a project that starts off exciting like that, if that becomes sort of corporate funded, then that can lose some of that appeal, and then you lose the people who were contributing because it's not a fun project now. It's someone's business. I'm sure everyone's thinking of different examples for that as well.
We have a question, actually probably a comment from the far back from Peter.
Hey, yeah, well, so I think fun projects can also be businesses. So I don't think there's necessarily a strict dichotomy there. But I think there's a couple of things involved in the question. It's a very good one, and one is sort of an aspect of the world that we live in, which is this concept of winner take all, and that dynamic applies to a number of these different things: recording studios, music, games, so many of these things, and that fundamentally I think tracks the overall trend in technology, whereby humans have a finite amount of attention. And then there's a snowball effect, there's a socialization effect. If you read only websites ABC and I only read websites DEF, then we have nothing to talk about. It's much more fun if we both read D and we can talk about that, and eventually that becomes larger and larger in our interaction. And if we have a third friend who also does that, there's a natural, almost like a physics level of the communication, the social patterns between people. The internet is really driving towards homogenization and centralization of beacons of this kind of thing. So that winner-take-all sort of thing doesn't just apply to software, it applies to anything that's social, which, because we're humans, is everything, right? So that is a dynamic that you're right, we do have to be aware of, but layered into there, I think some of the feedback or the resistance that you're hearing here about the natural stabilizing, I got to scratch my own itch, I'm going to hack on my own fun projects in my spare time kind of thing, is that we don't, we have to be very careful, even as we're criticizing or trying to be critical of that winner-take-all thing. We have to make sure that we don't. And I heard this actually expressed in a very ugly way one time at food camp, and it was this idea, almost the sentiment of, that we have a right to somebody's attention. And that's the thing about the internet that's so interesting, is that you have to always remember you don't have a right to anyone's attention. They can always turn away, they can always check out another project, they can always go do something that they think is more interesting than what you're doing. And so at the same time that we want to embrace diversity of viewpoints, of projects, of music, of everything, and we want to fight that homogenization and that winner-take-all thing in the interest of diversity, and artistic interest and whatnot. On the other side, we have to be very cognizant of the fact that we must always be useful to ourselves first. If you're open source and hacking on something that you don't like, you're probably not going to hack on it very long. But as we get users and as we create an ecosystem and community, we have to always be relevant to all these people. And I think one of the reasons Python has succeeded, Brett sort of talked about this, about Perl versus, and then Python's dominance. And then in the data science side of things, the dominant competitor for R, at least, for Python is clearly is R. And it's not Ruby, right? But in the web space for a long time, it was Ruby or Python. And now both of these people are looking at Go and Node and all these other things, right? So, but in each of these ecosystems that we compete with, we have to, the communities we create and the way we organize around our software, all of these things are I think in Python land tend to trend towards pragmatism, towards openness and welcoming new contributors, new ideas, welcoming businesses as well as open source sort of folks. And so there's dichotomy, again, not there's dichotomy between the two necessarily, but that kind of ethos means that we have strong confidence, I think, that the Python community will, that long tail, as other people start doing interesting things and as more people adopt, those projects come into the fold, right? The door's always open. And that's one way that we, as the folks that are building projects or building companies in this space, that's why we can assure that this community stays fresh and stays eclectic and open.
So at this point, I'd like to invite closing statements from our panelists and some of our impromptu panelists from the audience. I'll posit one question, a very loaded question for them to think about. Then we'll give them a round of applause, let them think about this question, and then open for closing statements. Why is it important to support NumFocus? It's a question I want everybody to think about. And let's give them a round of applause, and then we'll hear their closing statements.
So supporting, I've ended up with a different microphone. I can't hear myself now. Supporting NumFocus is a really good way to not like as far as supporting it from a large corporation point of view, where you may have an interest, and certainly Microsoft has an interest now in seeing the Python data science community as a whole raised up. Do you want to swap microphones?
No. Just continue with that one.
Like seeing the whole Python data science community raised up, and picking a project out of that. If Microsoft went out and said, we're going to support pandas, or we're going to support NumPy, inherently, while we have sort of somewhat, I mean, there's the more fungible financial resources, but as far as development support, it's very hard to have enough people or enough time to say we want to support all of these important projects and avoid saying we want to pick a winner. So it's great having NumFocus as a conduit to that, where we can, by supporting NumFocus, support all of these projects that are involved without necessarily having to pick a winner. I think picking CPython as a winner, which is more or less what we've done in that direction, is also lifting up the entire community. But NumFocus is certainly, as far as corporate sponsorship goes, a way that we can be involved and be supportive, and events like this and grants towards projects like Jupyter, without having to necessarily pick a winner and throw everything in on one particular project at the expense of the others that are also as important.
So as we interact with more and more, we being Jupyter and IPython, more and more large companies, as they consider using IPython and Jupyter in various ways, the biggest barrier to them adopting and engaging with us is not technical. It's not a question of the features we have or anything like that. It pertains to the legal infrastructure of our project and the formal governance model. And that is what NumFocus provides. And without that, I think the open source projects in the PyData community will continue to struggle to really engage companies in meaningful ways. And I think that's an area of growth that we need to undertake as a community, and supporting NumFocus directly affects that in a very concrete way.
So one big benefit NumFocus gives to a company wanting to contribute to a project is all the machinery is in place, the connections to the people that can contribute are all there. So there's a very low barrier to entry to just bump up a project a little bit. If a company wants to contribute and they have to allocate a developer or like find out like, okay, where do we find developers? Having NumFocus there, already having figured out all that information and set up all of the infrastructure for getting the money to the right people, finding new people, getting people excited, contributing to that can give much more impact more quickly than going it on your own.
I don't have much to add beyond what everyone has said, other than I'd like people to give to NumFocus so this conference keeps going so I can come back next year.
I appreciate James giving me a chance to say something. I'm Travis Oliphant, one of the original board members of NumFocus. It's fortunately being run by a much better group of people these days, people with a little more time. NumFocus for me, this community, this effort, and you can just see it in the faces and the personalities of all the different people that are creating the wonderful tools around us. It's bigger than one company, it's bigger than any one person or even small group of people. So NumFocus gives a place, a legal entity to allow you to interface with organizations that are also legal entities. I mean, there's a lot of companies want to participate, and NumFocus gives an opportunity for those companies to come together. It's a beautiful opportunity. It needs a lot more. So many of you can go and influence your companies to donate to NumFocus, and I encourage you to do that. Please do that. If you're ever grateful for anything I ever did in SciPy and NumPy, just do that, and you'll repay me in multiple spades. Do that. The other thing you can do, though, is just get involved personally in NumFocus. Maybe you don't have big influence with the check writers. There are still people that they need help. Leah, and she finally got one other full-time person working for NumFocus, Gina, and she's had a host of other volunteer. The board is volunteer. Everybody else is volunteer. But there are a lot of needs. Just keeping the website updated, keeping messaging going out. So just get involved. There's all kinds of committees to jump in and be involved with. And I'd like to thank James for doing such a great job in doing exactly that.
My name is Fernando Perez. Like Travis, I'm one of the original founders of NumFocus, and also like Travis, not anymore on the board for the same reasons. And to try to complement what the others have said better than I would, I want to emphasize a couple of things. That NumFocus goes beyond actually the PyData ecosystem. NumFocus is a foundation whose mission is software that is related to scientific research and education in the data science space, but we host the Julia team, we host the R Open Science project. We are a very inclusive foundation that really is interested in projects that interoperate around the data science space. So even though many of us come from a Python background, we have really a very inclusive view of the problem. So, and that's important because in many of you may be in environments where there's more than Python to the story. And number two, NumFocus's mission also goes beyond software, and this is important. NumFocus has a very strong interest not only in thinking about the specific individual software tools that we develop, but also about questions such as education, the diversity of our community, outreach to women in technology, outreach to communities that have been traditionally underrepresented, and the health of the broader ecosystem. NumFocus has, many of our tools come from traditionally, as has been said already, academic research environments, national labs. Numeric was maintained for a long time, the predecessor to NumPy in the national labs. And so NumFocus is a bridge between the academic communities, the sort of government research communities, and industry. And it's a very good space to kind of explore that intersection in ways that some of the other sort of pure industry foundations don't quite touch. So in that sense, we think that NumFocus is really a foundation that is extremely interesting and rich and complex, and we would like you to help us continue building it. And I will emphasize what Travis said. If you can't write checks, there's many other ways in which you can help us.
My name is Lorena Barba, and I'm a professor of mechanical and aerospace engineering in the George Washington University, and I'm also a board member of NumFocus. And, well, my fellow board members have said most of what I could have said as well about the roles of NumFocus. But I want to just add an explanation for those who might not realize that all of the small projects in the Python community are not able to collect money from as projects. So if you're not aware of what the mechanism is, what NumFocus provides is for these projects to be under the law able to receive money without the Internal Revenue Service being mad, because of course you can't just as a small project collect money. You know, there's got to be some organization that does it for you. In this case, the NumFocus nonprofit organization is able to collect money in the name of all the projects. And in addition, run these other very important community building activities such as the Women in Technology programs and so on. And this is a very important role for the sustainability of all the projects that we we know and love. And in addition, it's a manifestation of our democracy because it is run in a democratic way. It is self-organized, and like Travis said, people are volunteering and participating to provide governance through this organization. And it checks out what I call, I stole it from somebody, but I've adopted my GPS to yes, which is you have a good time, you meet wonderful people, and there's a wonderful community, and you develop your skills. These are the three things, three reasons why we're in the Python community, why we're here as well, and NumFocus helps us organize and keep that alive.
So I've asked for our last closing comment, our closingist or most nearly closing comment, to come from one of the gentlemen who have made this event possible. Shirok, with your closingist statements.
Okay, no pressure there. Actually, I'll make it very simple. If you look at the spectrum of software that the NumFocus organization in one way or another, directly or indirectly, has produced, and how much benefit Microsoft and companies like Microsoft are getting from it, I just feel a very strong obligation for us to pay back. Now, you can do this in different ways. I mean, right now we can take out our checkbook and do that. We've had employees that, like I said, like the people said before, are contributing the open source efforts in one way or another, focus on Python. And I did a back of an envelope calculation. I think we've spent about $1 million in donations in one form or another, pretty much focused on Python in the past 5 years. So this is something that we should do. We should pay back. Now we're going to find different avenues to pay back and support NumFocus. It's a very noble committee of people, in terms of the direction that they're going, and very, very high quality technology that is being used in all aspects of our company, from Visual Studio all the way to Azure in our SDKs, and we want to see that expand. I want to see Python become the scripting language, the cross-platform scripting language for our cloud. Right now, everything's focused on .NET, but now that we support Linux and Windows, I'd love for Python to become that language and that technology. Therefore, with NumFocus being in the very center of that universe, I feel a strong obligation to support them in any way possible, and I encourage everybody else to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And one last round of applause for all of you for attending and all of our panelists. Thank you so much for attending.